An introduction of Islamic Transactions Part 2. Approved forfeiture clauses. A sale-based transaction in Islamic law is considered binding upon both the buyer and the seller. This means that once the sale is considered complete from the perspective of Islamic law, both parties cannot cancel the deal, even if the product or price is yet to be exchanged. The wisdom behind this stance in Islamic law is to ensure that the benefit which both the buyer and seller aim to achieve from the sale is truly realized. A party having the ability to cancel a deal unconditionally doesn't really allow the buyer to take real ownership of the product, or the seller of the price, which really makes the actual deal in the first instance void of any substantial and legal benefit. Islam does recognize, however, the human element to every buyer and seller, as well as exceptional trade circumstances, and as a result has permitted a number of conditional stipulations known as forfeiture clauses, which are defined in Islamic law and aim to protect both the buyer and seller from any harm due to the transaction. These forfeiture clauses range from clauses stipulated directly by Islamic law to clauses approved by Islamic law but based upon defined conditions stipulated and agreed upon between the buyer and seller. These clauses are as follows. 1. Khiyar al-Majlis, or a clause to forfeit a transaction that is specific to the place of contract. This feature to forfeit a transaction has been put into place directly by Islamic law and allows for either the buyer or seller to opt out of a deal as long as they have not departed each other. After its completion, this feature thus expires once the two parties depart from each other. 2. Khiyar ash-Shart, or an applicable clause through stipulation of the buyer to cancel a contract within a specified time period. This clause is an example of the forfeiture clauses approved by Islamic law, with its application dependent upon the buyer opting for it and the seller approving it. If the buyer enters this feature as a condition for entering into a deal before it's finalized, and it is accepted by the seller, the buyer will successfully be able to opt out of the deal after the transaction is completed, within the set time frame of the clause. 3. Khiyar al-Aib, or a defect or non-performance clause. This feature to forfeit a transaction has been put into place directly by Islamic law and gives the purchaser of a product or service the right to the following two solutions in the event of a seller failing to deliver a product or service as promised. A legal channel to cancel the transaction and receive back the entire amount paid for the product or service. A legal challenge which allows the transaction to stand, on condition the purchaser is refunded an amount that equates to the value difference between the product or service in its complete form and its appropriate price in its defective or incomplete form. The appropriate way, as discussed in Islamic scholarship, with regards to working out the value difference would be through using a fractional difference formula, which is clarified in the following example. Let's say we have a scenario whereby a buyer named Abdullah purchases a vehicle from a seller named Mario for $30,000. After the purchase is complete and counter values exchanged, Abdullah finds out that there is an engine defect which couldn't have happened since the purchase of the vehicle and was not disclosed to him before the transaction. In determining the value difference in this case, Islamic scholarship will seek the advice of those who have expertise in this area. If the experts, for example, explain that a fair price for the car in question is around $2,500 if in normal condition, and $20,000 in its affected condition, it would be determined that the fractional difference between the two circumstances is a fifth, or $5,000. In this instance, Islamic law would allow Abdullah to A. Return the vehicle and receive back the entire fee of $30,000. Or B. Keep the vehicle and receive back from the buyer a fifth of the price paid, which equals $5,000. Traders in Islamic law. Every financial transaction has its pillars and conditions as shown in this booklet. Another important feature of a transaction is the placement of conditions between the traders in relation to the actual transaction, which if agreed to, would entail both the buyer and seller consciously and willingly agreeing for the deal to be completed in a particular way. Another important feature of a transaction is the placement of conditions between the traders in relation to the actual transaction, which if agreed to, would entail both the buyer and seller consciously and willingly agreeing for the deal to be completed in a particular way. These conditions between traders are known as buyer or seller clauses and differ from the conditions for trade, in the following two ways. 1. The conditions for trade are stipulated by Islamic law, whilst the clauses between traders are stipulated by the traders themselves. 2. In the event of a condition for trade not being fulfilled, the entire transaction would be considered incomplete, which nullifies any transfer of ownership from the outset, as if the parties never engaged the trade process in the first place. However, in the event of all the conditions for trade in Islamic law being fulfilled, but a clause stipulated by a trader not being fulfilled, the actual transaction will be considered as complete in Islamic law, with Islamic law giving the trader whose rights were not fulfilled the choice of either accepting the situation for what it is and continuing with the transaction, or choosing to reverse the transaction such that both countervalues are returned back to the buyer and seller respectively. In terms of Islamic law, traders are allowed to stipulate any conditions as long as these conditions do not lead to making something established in Islamic law as permissible, impermissible, or making something impermissible, permissible. In light of this important rule regarding clauses between traders, Islamic law has classified these clauses into two categories as follows. 1. Clauses which Islamic law considers appropriate and lists them as acceptable. 2. Clauses which Islamic law considers inappropriate and lists them as rejected. Examples of acceptable clauses include confirmation clauses. These clauses aim to confirm matters of trade already established in Islamic law, such as a buyer of a vehicle stipulating a clause that the seller will be responsible for any substantial vehicle defects known to the seller and not highlighted at the time of the transaction. This clause is one which is already stipulated by Islamic law, and offers the buyer this right during a transaction even without it being listed as a clause by the buyer. Collateral clause, which is a condition entered into the contract by either party mandating some form of collateral being part of the transaction which can be used by the affected party to recover any losses in the event of one of the two parties failing in fulfilling their part of the contract. An example of this would be a seller of a mobile phone on hire purchase requesting a watch from a buyer, which will be kept in safekeeping by the seller until the buyer can pay the entire amount for the phone. Descriptive clauses. This refers to a clause stipulated by any party describing certain particulars related to the counter values of a transaction, such as a seller of a vehicle stipulating new banknotes, or a buyer stipulating that the vehicle be a particular color. Exception and exclusion-based clauses. These are stipulations placed in the contract by the seller particularly, which allows for the seller to benefit from the sold product for a specific period of time, such as a seller of a home or vehicle who stipulates that the buyer allows for the seller to use the vehicle or home for a week or month after the sale is complete, or a clause that excludes certain accessories added to the vehicle by the seller from being part of the transaction, such as a mobile phone holder or seat covers. Restrictive clauses. Such as a condition placed by a seller which stipulates that the buyer gives the seller the first right to purchase back the item sold in the event that the buyer decides to sell the purchased item in the future. Contract stipulation clause. This is a clause placed by the seller in a contract which stipulates that the sale only goes ahead between the buyer and seller on condition of the buyer entering into another transaction with the seller. An example of this would be Abdullah selling his house for $200,000 to Ahmed, on condition that Ahmed sells his vehicle to Abdullah for $30,000. Or that Ahmed leases his vehicle for a particular period of time, and a particular fee to Abdullah. However, this clause is only considered binding in Islamic law if it doesn't lead to an impermissible outcome. An example of an impermissible outcome would be a seller stipulating that the sale only proceeds on condition that the buyer loans money to the seller or vice versa, due to the messenger forbidding a transaction in which loans are stipulated as a part of it. Penalty clause. This clause is considered acceptable in Islamic law if used in labor and construction-related contracts, and not purchases. With this clause, a contractee can stipulate a penalty upon a contractor in the event of the contractor delaying completion of the desired project on time. An example of an acceptable application of this clause would be of a person contracting a construction company to build a house for $100 with a penalty clause which stipulates the contractor losing 1% of the stated amount for every month that passes without the project being completed after the agreed completion date. On the contrary, an unacceptable application of this clause would be in the case of a seller or service provider stipulating late fees, or fines upon a person for delaying on paying anything payment-related, such as a bill or debt. Circumstantial clause. This clause refers to a condition placed in a contract which makes it dependent upon the occurrence of an event. An example of this clause would be a transaction in which the seller says that he will sell his car to a buyer on condition that the seller's father is pleased with the sale. Upon the buyer accepting this condition and the seller's father approving his son's actions, the contract immediately becomes binding upon both parties. Another example of this clause is a transaction accepted by the Hanbali scholars of Islamic law which entails a transaction with a non-refundable down payment, or deposit, being stipulated as part of the contract. In this contract, the buyer is required to pay a small non-refundable percentage of the price up front to the seller, which is considered part of the entire payment in the event of the buyer completing the purchase. However, if the buyer decides against completing the purchase, the seller keeps the percentage taken. In the above section, we discussed clauses that are acceptable to place in a contract. There are however particular clauses placed by the two parties within a contract which Islamic law invalidates. Examples of unacceptable clauses include clauses which bring about a result which the Sharia has forbidden from the outset. An example of this clause would be a contract stipulation clause which necessitates riba, or interest, being a part of the transaction, such as a condition which stipulates that one of the parties lend the other party money in order for the transaction to proceed. This clause is considered illegal and non-binding as it creates a benefit for the lender which is forbidden in Islam, as Islamic law forbids any benefit whatsoever to be gained by the loan or because of the loan. Any benefit created as a result of a loan is considered a form of riba in Islamic law. Another example of this type of invalidated clause is when the clause stipulates that the transaction takes place in a way that prevents either of the two parties from completing an Islamically prescribed act, for instance a clause stipulating that the transaction takes place after the second Adhan of Jumu'ah. This is forbidden in Islamic law due to verse in the Quran where Allah says, "O you who have believed, when the Adhan is called for the prayer on the day of Jumu'ah, then proceed to the remembrance of Allah, and leave trade. That is better for you, if you only knew." 62-9. Similarly, a clause stipulating that the transaction is completed in a place that Islamic law forbids is also invalid. An example of this would be a clause stipulating that the transaction is completed in the masjid. Islamic law forbids all forms of profit-based transactions from occurring in the houses of Allah Almighty. It is important to note that this prohibition includes all forms of electronic-based sales or purchases, whereby a person may purchase a plane ticket, hotel reservation or trade shares, or currency via the internet, a clause which prevents an objective from the objectives of trade in Islam taking effect. An example of this clause would be a condition which prevents the buyer from taking complete ownership of the purchased product, such as a condition which forbids the buyer from ever selling the purchased product. This clause prevents complete ownership of the purchased product from being transferred to the buyer, and causes the transaction to only resemble a sale, without actually being one, which goes against the objectives of trade in Islam.